So do please gather. It's lovely to see the room so full. There are a few seats over here next to Annie. Actually, the front row is more full than normal. So you all know the why is it Episcopalians? Fortunately, we have lots of Baptists here today, but why is it Episcopalians are always sitting on the back row of the church? And the answer is there are no seats in the parking lot. Friends, my name is Ian Markham. I'm the Dean and President of Virginia Theological Seminary. A very warm welcome to both those in the room and also all those who are online. And I know we're all looking forward to the Reverend Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams' keynote and her inaugural lecture as the holder of the Dodge Chair. The invitation to take a named chair as a full professor is the greatest honor that a seminary can bestow on a faculty colleague. It is an invitation to be written into the history of the institution as a person called to profess with expertise and authority in a certain discipline. The inaugural lecture is a moment of significance. The practice goes back to the medieval period in European universities. The roots are actually grounded in European cathedrals, which were often linked to universities. It is an invitation to invite the newly honored professor to define their approach to their subject area. The Dodge Chair is one of the oldest faculty chairs at Virginia Theological Seminary. It was made possible through the generosity of Canadian and American lumber companies. And Anson Dodge Jr. would later study at the General Seminary and become an Episcopal clergyman. Canadian money helped rebuild the faculty at Virginia Theological Seminary after the Civil War, with a gift from the two brothers, Anson Phelps Dodge and his brother Cleveland Dodge. And these gifts became the foundation of the Dodge Chair. Anson's widow would later give a series of books to the VTS library around 1920, and she lived at the time in Alexandria. The Dodge Chair is one of the earliest faculty chairs in this institution and was first held by the Reverend Dr. Joseph Packard in 1871, and most recently held by the Reverend Dr. A. Catherine Grebe before her retirement from full faculty duties, although she continues as our Director of the Center for Anglican Communion Studies in 2020. It is truly an honor for the seminary to have such an esteemed scholar and faculty member holding the Dodge Chair. I now turn to our good friend, the Bishop Phoebe Rofe, an alum, a student of Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams, and past Vice President of the Board of Trustees, to introduce Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams. Please welcome Phoebe Rofe.
Thank you so much, Dean Markham, and what an honor and a privilege it is this morning, or this afternoon, to stand before you to introduce my dear friend, Dr. Judy, as she is known around campus. Dr. Judy has served on the faculty of VTS since 2002. Prior to that, she was on the faculty of Hartford Seminary from 1994 to 2002 as the professor of Hebrew Bible. Her academic qualifications are stellar. She holds a Master of Divinity, a Master of Philosophy, and a PhD from Yale University, and her undergraduate degree is from Princeton University. There are so many things that I can say about Judy from a professional standpoint, but I would just like to take a moment of personal privilege to say, Judy, we see you. We see you. And it is no surprise to me that this room is standing room only, because you have poured into so many people, starting with your spouse and your children, your sister clergy who were here supporting you in large numbers, not only the students of this institution, but your faculty colleagues, staff, your Alfred Street family. You have given so much of yourself to others. You know, a book came out a few years ago that said everything I needed to learn, I learned in kindergarten. Basics such as thank you, and I'm sorry, I love you, and I see you. And I don't know about you, brothers and sisters, but sometimes in the church, we don't do a good job of saying thank you. I love you. I appreciate you. And that's a whole nother topic. But on this day, Dr. Judy, we want to say we thank you. We love you. We see you. And we want you to have all of your flowers now. 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 So with that, I would like to bring forward the one and only, the Reverend Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams.
You had me
Issues.
Bishop Rove, thank you for that beautiful introduction. I know that we are at a seminary convocation, and I do understand that we are not in church. But I must say that at this moment in my life, whenever I hear someone speak words of praise about me, what I hear is, when I look back over my life, and I think things over, I can truly say that I've been blessed. It has been a blessing to be a teacher here at Virginia Theological Seminary for the last 22 years. And it is my joy to be a convocation speaker. I want to welcome our alumni, all the 4s and the 9s, and I want to give a special shout out to the class of 2004. When I arrived in 2002, I started by teaching a seminar with some members of the class of 2004 who were in their middler year. And they have the distinction, yes, I'm pointing, of breaking me in as a faculty member here, and break me they did. Love you, love you, love you, love you. Thank you, Dean Markham. You have always made this a hospitable place for me, and I appreciate that. I want to thank Dean Knowles in her absence and Acting Dean Ross Kane for their unfailing support. I want to thank my family for being here today, my church family, my pastor, the Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley, my faculty colleagues and friends, and a special welcome to the Womanist Conclave, who blesses me by their presence today. And they will be a blessing. Oh, Dean Knowles in her presence. Good to see her. The Womanist Conclave will be a blessing to you tomorrow. Dr. Weems and Dr. Bridgman will be in my Old Testament class at 9:30 in Addison 101, and we will then have a panel on womanism and resilience in this room at 1:30 p.m. tomorrow. And I must say one other thing. People in the academy talk about their father or mother in the profession and in the field. And I am like Moses in that I have two mothers. One of them is Ellen Davis, who taught me how to read a text. She taught me how to ask questions and to go close to a text when it doesn't make sense instead of running away. And just like Moses, the story says there comes a time when Moses' mother could contain him no longer. There came a time when I needed another example, and that came to me in the person of Dr. Renita Weems. And I know she doesn't like a lot of fuss, so I'm going to say this really quickly. Dr. Weems embodied and modeled for me how I could do this thing in this body. And I would be remiss to stand here in your presence and not say thank you publicly. Thank you. Now, the title for this afternoon's lecture is Find Your Way Back, Identity in the Ancestral Narratives. And the text that we're going to look at today is Genesis 16. You have a handout, and it's going to appear on the screen. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Well, then Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarah, "Your slave is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she, Hagar, ran away from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" And she said, "I am running away from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall live at odds with all his kin." So she named the Lord. Let's just say that again. So she named the Lord who spoke to her. "You are Elroy." For she said, "Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him?" Therefore the well was called Beer Lahai. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. I am currently teaching a seminar on the ancestors in Genesis 12 to 50. And years ago when I taught it, one day a little bit of a kerfluffle erupted when there were students arguing for Leah versus Rachel. There were folks who felt as though Rachel was being demanding, and there were other folks who wanted to kind of say, no, Leah is the person who is the villain. And they were going back and forth, and I noticed one student was sitting silent but looking very disturbed. And so I finally called on her and asked her what was wrong. And she said, "Am I missing something? Are they even real?" We call the ancestral narratives in Genesis historical because we can assign them to a particular period, the Middle or Early Bronze Age, and some of the names or practices and laws can be associated with this time, and that's why we say the stories are historical. We can locate them in history. But I'm convinced that it is not the historical correspondences that make the stories live. It's the art of storytelling itself that makes people want to fight over Leah versus Rachel. The story world is more than an imitation of life. Using repetition, suspense, symbolism, archetypes, and characterization, the text is inviting us in to delight us, confuse us, confound us, and empower us. It does something to us. Robert Alter describes it as peculiar literature. And Eric Auerbach in Mimesis puts it this way: the Bible subjects us to its demands with the weight of a God who inspires. Genesis 12 to 50 is one of these story worlds. It's what we used to call the patriarchal narrative, stories about our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And now we call them the ancestral narratives in recognition that the forefathers could not have survived without the foremothers. These are Israel's foundational stories. They come from multiple sources, J, E, and P. It's a composite text. And I love this because it's one that from the very beginning resists a single narrative. From our 2 creation counts to the 4 Gospels, the Bible teaches us that anything worth telling has to be told at least twice. And some things have to be told over and over and over again. Harold Fish is right when he describes these compelling stories as poetry with a purpose. And he would also be right if he said that it is poetry that gets repurposed. In its final form, the text is a literary and dialogic entity, an open invitation for Israel to find her way back and remember who she is. I'm interested in the role of embodiment in our work of interpretation. We do our work not as disembodied brains, but as contextualized, intersectional people, formed, shaped, and signified by family, cultural and religious values, education or lack thereof. We bring things to the text. And the text itself reflects an equally complex and layered world. In the ancestral narratives, then, I'm interested in the interaction between our embodiment and that of the text. And one of the ways we experience embodiment in the text is through the development of characterization. I'm interested in how our characters get along with the characters in these ancestral narratives. My approach to this work is womanist in location and literary in approach. As someone who stands at the intersection of gender, race, and class, my approach to Scripture often focuses on the themes of gender, sexuality, agency, and advocacy, foregrounding women on the margins, and illuminating children and childhood. Mitzi Smith contends that a womanist reading of Scripture is a relevant and contextual critical interpretation that attempts to expose and condemn oppression and violence in sacred contexts. She goes on to say that when we turn a blind eye to biases and violence in our sacred contexts, the likelihood is great that we will learn to internalize the oppression in contexts and read as oppressed people, or perhaps oppressors, rather than as a people who value and seek freedom for ourselves and for others. If we turn a blind eye, we are not only traumatized, we will traumatize others. So womanist approaches are embodied approaches. Womanist readings are holistic, contextual, critical. And this approach is reflected in a dialogic methodology. A dialogic methodology means that when I study Scripture, I'm not looking for just one answer. Dialogic truth means that we will have multiple truths from the same text. Dialogic truth requires a plurality of consciousnesses. This is a truth that cannot be contained by a single mind. I love this. If the Bible is inspired, I shouldn't be able to understand it all by myself. Dialogic truth is embodied truth, and it cannot be separated from the individual who speaks it. In fact, it's bound to the speaker. Dialogic truth tends toward event rather than system. And my favorite, there is an unfinalizability to dialogic truth. Such an approach is compatible with these multiple voices in Scripture. A dialogic approach embraces the conversation between sources and traditions rather than trying to squeeze them into a single voice. So I always say to my students, we have two creation accounts. Which one? And the answer is yes, right? This kind of approach gravitates towards community and works best in community. A womanist perspective and a dialogic methodology means that embodiment matters. And as I say this, I don't want to make it sound like I'm saying something new when I say embodiment matters. Biblical interpretation has always been embodied. Come with me back to 1962 with Gerhard von Rod's reading of Genesis 16, where he describes the legal underpinnings of what happens when Sarah goes to Abram and complains about this situation now that Hagar has conceived. And Abram says, "Your maid is in your hand." He is essentially transferring Hagar back to Sarah. All right? With an emphasis on the fulfillment of the promise as his lens, von Rad, in his interpretation of this text, quotes Hermann Gunkel, who says, "Abraham plays a rather unhappy role between these two raw-boned women." I had to stop for a minute to figure out what raw-boned meant. Some 30 years later, the Women's Bible Commentary comes, and Susan Neidich's treatment of Genesis 16 uses the lens of matriarchal barrenness and the endangered child. And her reading offers a more compassionate understanding of Sarah's predicament, and it recognizes Hagar's encounter with the angel as the first annunciation scene in Genesis. This treatment in this reading of Hagar brings Hagar in from the sidelines of obscurity and promotes her to a member of the supporting cast. Then we have Dolores Williams' treatment of Genesis 16 in her identification as Hagar as the prototype, a patron saint, if you will, for African American women, whose ancestral history of enslavement and more recent experiences caused them to see in Hagar a symbol of survival and defiance. Williams uses the lens of contemporary experiences of African American women to bring this passage to life in a way that places Hagar in the center. Calling upon the experiences of these women, Williams invites us to consider Hagar's full humanity and to remember the intersectionality of all interpreters. Now, as I read Genesis 16, I cannot help but see Hagar. In fact, I'm hyper aware of her. Once I know she exists, I'm looking for her. So let's look at where she enters the narrative. Because in the same way that each reader has a particular embodiment, characterization in the narrative is the embodiment of every person, named or unnamed. And their description places them in a particular social location and puts flesh on their bones. 16:1 begins with these words, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave whose name was Hagar." So what I've done here is divide the verse in the English and in the Hebrew so that you can see where the division comes in the Hebrew. That mark underneath that last word is the halfway marker in the Hebrew text. The passage begins with the known characters of Abram and Sarai, and the known fact of Sarai's presumed infertility. And it is against the background of that presumed infertility that a new character is introduced. She is introduced in the text with these words. This is the second half of the verse. "And she had, or to her, handmaid, Egyptian, and her name Hagar." This is the second half of the verse. The first half of the verse establishes Sarai's status as a wife of Abram, one who bore him no children. Now, this verse reminds us of the poetic nature that is often evident in Hebrew prose. Here, this verse works almost like parallel lines, an A and a what's more B. The first verse is set up to see these two women as a call and response, as if Hagar's existence comes into focus because of Sarai's infertility. Everything we know about Hagar at this point is in relationship to Sarai and Sarai's situation with Abram. So the structure of the verse not only consists of parallel lines, but creates symmetry between Sarai and Abraham. Look at this. It begins with Sarai, the first name, it's end Sarai, and ends with Hagar. So that the verse is bookended by these two names. Notice, too, how the belonging works. Sarah is identified as the wife of Abram, as belonging to Abram, and Hagar introduced as the maidservant of Sarai. The first half describes what or who belongs to Abram, and the second half outlines what belongs to Sarai. From the very moment she enters the scene, Hagar reminds us there is no way to talk about slavery without talking about embodiment, because in slavery, the body is commodified. She occupies a space in the narrative in a way that is commensurate with the way that a slave occupies space within the world of an owner. At this point, what we call the story of Hagar is actually a story about Hagar's body. She is the possibility of fertility. She is a womb, hopefully one that the Lord has not closed. And even her name, according to Will Gaffney, is not necessarily her name, but her status. It is masculine, not feminine, and utterly generic, the stranger, the wanderer, evoking a practice of calling marginalized people outside of their names or pronouns. Hagar's introduction in the story is also the first account of her dismemberment. Dr. Alexis Wells Agogometh's work on the religious cultures of enslaved women in the Lower South sets up a dynamic of dismemberment and remembrance. Women's experiences of slavery are acts of dismemberment, as their personhood, autonomy, dignity, rights, etc. are consistently and systematically stripped away. Characterization in the text tells us about the character and the storyteller, and in this story, Hagar is a means to an end. I have noticed, whenever you talk to church people about this chapter in the Bible, this is how they describe it. In this chapter, Sarai and Abram got tired of waiting on God and took things into their own hands. Y'all have heard that, right? But the thing that they take into their own hands is Hagar, all right? So the character is created with language about her physical proximity to Sarah, her status in the household, her gender, her ethnicity, her nationality, the details of her social location, and yet we have little knowledge of her. Reading this first verse as parallel lines also allows the second half of the verse to reflect back on the first half. In this world, Sarai and the male child she longs for are also commodities. Reduced to a womb that won't comply with the expectations of society, her pain and desperation is palpable. And wounded as she may be, Sarai has agency. The verbs describing her action are straightforward. It says she said to her husband, offering a plan, and Abram listened, another word for comply. In verse 3, it tells us she took and gave. She took Hagar and gave Hagar to Abram as concubine. Thus far, the action in the story is driven by Sarai's character. She conceives a plan, presents it to Abram, places Hagar into the arrangement that she hopes will work in her favor and provide her with a son. She's acting within her role as the primary and heretofore only wife, and she is successful. But we should note in this third verse that the verbs she took and she gave are interrupted by the phrase, after Abram had dwelt in the land of Canaan 10 years. 10 years have passed since the promise was given, and Sarai only moves further from hope. And now I wonder if Sarai's action is rash or one that she has carefully considered. I wonder about Hagar's age. Was she a young girl when she came into Abram's household? Did she only recently come of age? Remember also that Sarai knows what it is like to be offered up to further the well-being or the ambition of her husband. The narrative continues in this very terse way. Abram went into Hagar, she conceived. The narrative style makes Hagar's conception seem easy. And thus far, Abram and Sarai are active characters. They speak, they listen, they act. Sarah takes and gives. Abram went into Hagar, and they're doing all of this action, and now the whole world gets turned upside down with Hagar's very first action, which is conceiving. The verse in this section is terse and to the point. He went into Hagar and she conceived. Plan enacted and successful. And the last word in the first half of this verse forms an alliterative word pair with the first word in the second half. It says, Vatahar, she conceived, Vatera, and she saw. Both are second person feminine forms. She conceived, and when she saw, her mistress was lowered in her esteem, literally lowered in her eyes. No dialogue between the two women is recorded here, but Sarah just lost some of her status, some of her privilege. And when you are not at the top, but above somebody else, the loss of privilege is its own death. Up to this moment, Abraham and Sarah act upon Hagar, and now that she has conceived, Hagar acts. Note the verbs associated with Hagar's actions are not giving and taking. They're all related to seeing. The first seeing that she conceived is a recognition. A change has taken place in her body and correspondingly in the household. The second seeing, or sight-related action is that her mistress is lessened in her eyes. Now, I am tempted as a woman of color to see this as a reference to a look. Women have learned to communicate with their eyes in part because some of the spaces they occupy, they are not allowed to speak. I think of women in hijab or women who wear burqa where all that can be seen are their eyes. African American women have a distinct system of communicating with their eyes. Raised eyebrow, cut eye, side eye roll, to name a few. And don't forget your mother controlling you all the way from the choir loft to where you are on the next to last row with a look. It could have been a look, but it was also most certainly tied to perception. The reference to Hagar's sight and estimation is a reminder that the construct of hierarchy demands that the people in the construct believe or at least buy into the hierarchy. Some type of buy-in is required for the system to work, and Hagar's perception threatens the entire show. It threatens Sarah's tentative position. And this is a powerful moment in the narrative because what Hagar sees cannot be unseen. That's why Sarai goes to Abram. She goes to Abram, and Abram essentially demotes Hagar from wife back to slave. The conflict here is about jurisdiction. Is Hagar Abram's wife or Sarai's servant? When the conflict arises, Abram's response is to relegate Hagar back to the role of handmaid. This allows Sarai to treat Hagar harshly and remind Hagar that she is exactly that, Hagar, the foreigner, the stranger. The language used to describe Sarai's treatment of Hagar is anah, to humble, mishandle, and afflict. It's the same verb used to describe Israel's treatment at the hands of the Egyptians. And now we see Hagar's next action. She flees from the hand of her oppressor into the wilderness, and Hagar's response to her dismemberment is to go into the wilderness. A womanist lens sees in Hagar's fleeing the practices of slaves in the American South out into the woods to worship. After a day of having humanity robbing labor, the escape into the woods was an action taken against dismemberment or erasure. In liminal space, oppressed people find an alternate universe where the hope of remembering and retaining one's identity is possible. In the wilderness, Hagar encounters the angel of the Lord. Now, I love this part of the text because it says the angel of the Lord found her there. The angel of the Lord knows her name and asks her a question. Clearly, the question is proffered not to get information, but as an invitation. And the greeting that he gives is a platform for what comes next. The angel says, Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She says, I'm running away. I'm running away from Sarai, my mistress. In response to that, we get her very short words are in contrast to the lengthy response of the angel. In fact, the lengthy words of the angel lead us to the conclusion that the narrative material leading up to this moment exists for the purpose of getting to this space. I believe all this nonsense that's happened so far has occurred just so we can have this moment between Sarai and the angel. We have to have this theophany. We need this annunciation. A dialogic approach to scripture says that theophany is a moment that exists outside of space and time. And although Hagar may not realize it, she is having that moment. Although much of our attention gets taken up with the drama at the beginning, the structure of the narrative wants us to hear the words of this angel who becomes the Lord, and it has three components. The angel of the Lord said to her. We see that phrase 3 times. The first thing that the angel tells Hagar is that she is to return to her mistress and submit to her. Every time I say that, somebody goes, The next thing that the angel of the Lord does is promise that she will have more descendants than she can count. The last thing that the angel of the Lord tells Hagar is about the child she carries, a promise about this child, Ishmael. 3 parts to the Annunciation: return and submit, promise of a great nation too many to count, and a word about the promised child. After the Annunciation and Theophany, the story moves quickly to resolution with a birth report. The text doesn't say anything about her return, how she was received, doesn't tell us how they got along, none of that. Just that a child was born, and Abram names him Ishmael at the age of 86. So if the story is designed to move us to these words that the angel of the Lord said to Hagar, what do we do with the words that the angel of the Lord said to her? And unfortunately, we do not have as an option, I will take numbers 2 and 3, please. In Genesis 16, not only does God not visit punishment on Hagar's oppressors, but tells Hagar to go back to the house of bondage and submit to her mistress. We cannot avoid this. Kathleen O'Connor tells us that Hagar had to go back out of the necessity for having shelter. I kind of get that, but then I remember that God took care of prophets out in the wilderness by sending, right? So we could have some other options here. We also need to recognize that in this 3-part message, the first part of the message is to return, not the last. How would this have sounded if God said, I've got good news and then bad news? You're going to have a great nation. You're going to have this great son, and you're going to have to do this. That's not how it's set up. It starts with return and submit. I want us to think about the structure and recognize that placement matters. Her placement in this physical household matters. She is called to go back and hold space. Hagar's body must go back into that space. This is not the God of liberation that I was hoping for. Moreover, the promise that Hagar will be a great nation, and we want to hold space for the fact that the promise was made directly to her, it does not remove the sting of the first part. But I do believe it evokes a God who sometimes in response to difficulties does not change the situation, but creates an alternate universe. This is a God who creates a different way, a God who has more than one promise, a God who has more than one blessing, Esau. It is a God who is understood to have more than one way with dealing with oppression in the world. The passage evokes a God who speaks of promise. The placement of this in the episode becomes even more interesting when we consider an observation made by David Cotter. David Cotter, in his Genesis commentary, takes some work from Jerome T. Walsh and makes a structural analysis of the entire Abraham cycle. Now, there's a warning. Whenever people do these nice little patterns, there's always some finagling that has to happen, all right? Almost always. But what I'm intrigued with is that in his assessment, Genesis chapter 16 is the focal point of the entire Abraham cycle. This is why we're here. And in order to do that, he has to pull out chapter 21. But even if we critique him for that, what we know for sure is that Genesis 16 is in between the 2 accounts of God's covenant with Abraham. The covenant on either side of what happens with God and Hagar in the wilderness. So much of how we read this story ends up being tied to what we designate as the genre of the story. In the same way that the examples I gave earlier from the 3 commentaries shows us how each interpreter arrives at their observations based on who they designate as the main character, so does the genre adjust through the lens of the interpreter. If Abraham and Sarah are my main characters and the promised child is Isaac, then Hagar and Ishmael fall into the category of threat to the promise. If we, however, look at the content of Genesis 16 and recognize the promise that God makes to Hagar, Hagar is an ancestress. And this story then becomes a threat to an ancestress story. In that, Hagar occupies center stage as both the one endangered and the one preserved. This preservation is not without problems, but the promise is undeniable. And Hagar's naming of God, El Roi, as a God who sees, seals the deal, leading to a landmark moment where both Ishmael and God are named. God names Hagar's unborn child, and unlike Jacob in Genesis 32, Hagar does not ask for God's name, but ascribes one in recognition of the miracle that has transpired. Hagar's placement matters. Hagar returning to this space matters. A womanist reading identifies Hagar's return as an iconic one, and by icon I mean one that we look through. Hagar's return to a place of oppression where she will remain for a period of time, she does eventually get out, is the image of someone who holds space for the one who will come behind her. Stay with me here. Hagar's movement in this narrative reminds us of women who stayed in inhospitable places, not because they didn't have other options, but because of what they were building for future generations. In their embodiment, they held space for the next generation, and hold space they did. In this reading, Hagar represents those women who ran for national office when the odds of winning were slim, just so they wouldn't be the first one. This is the story that reminds us of women who were the first and only, functioning in dysfunction, unseen because of the promise to come. They remained in difficult roles so companies couldn't act like they hadn't seen a person of color before. And they returned back to be an example not just to the next generation, but to the ones who were there. I believe Hagar has to go back to bear witness so Abraham and Sarah can see that God works an embodiment other than theirs. By staying in that house and giving birth to Ishmael, Hagar is a physical reminder that decenters Abraham and Sarah as the only story. The story was never just about you. It was never just about us. In this way, Hagar holds space literally for the next generation. And Ishmael will be free. Remember that weird little translation, and he shall be a wild ass of a man, which is such an unfortunate translation because that word pare is like a zebra. It is like an animal in the wilderness that cannot be tamed. Hagar places herself back in Abram's space to hold space for a generation that cannot be tamed. And in this passage, we hear of a God who sees. And the child's name means God hears, which is really interesting because we don't really get God hearing until chapter 21. But in this chapter, we have God seeing and hearing, carrying the name of this child and tying it to God's action. We should also note when it comes to this contrast between Ishmael and Isaac, that Ishmael is the only one of Abraham's children with the theophoric element in his name. I also want to raise the possibility that Hagar's placement in this text, in the middle of these two covenant scenes, makes Hagar a counter-tradition in Scripture. A dialogic approach makes a strong case for the way in which we observe both tradition and counter-tradition in the Bible. One example of a tradition would be, it's always the firstborn that gets the blessing. And that never happens. The tradition is here, and it never happens. God is always operating and working in a way that does not abide by all of the convenient rules that we have made. In the ancestral narratives, second-born Isaac, second-born Jacob, Judah number 4, Joseph number 11. Men are supposed to name children, but seems like women are having a lot of say in what happens. I love this story because the angel tells Hagar what she's going to name the child, and then at the end, and Abram named him Ishmael. I wonder how that happened. From a theological perspective, we see God in the movement of God in the counter-tradition. In counter-tradition, we see that God will do what God will do. And this kind of literary and dialogic work reminds us of how our own social location shapes the questions we ask and determines the lenses that we use. For me, it is a call to remember that Israel, the people who tell these stories, used to see herself in the counter-tradition. In her own context, she was often the underdog, the trickster, the nomads, the enslaved, the wilderness people, even as she aspired to become a conquering nation. The presence of Hagar in the middle of this story is a reminder to Israel that she cannot forget, that she was once a slave. This term, this counter-tradition, describes the space that has long been inhabited by those at the intersection of race, gender, and class. Hagar's story is here as the counter-tradition, in my mind, for Israel at a time of exile. Stay with me here. In 16, Hagar comes in as a slave and becomes a wife and then becomes a slave again. She comes in as a slave and then becomes a wife, which means that she enters into covenant relationship and then pushes against the limits of the covenant relationship only to return back to slave. The story of Hagar then allows her to symbolize Israel in the same way that Sarah symbolizes Israel in Genesis chapter 12 by going into Egypt and coming out. In other words, both of these women function as matriarchs, and in these narratives tell in their bodies the story of Israel. For Israel in exile, Hagar is their mother. Because they are in an untenable situation, but have a word of promise spoken over them that they hope to bring to life. Hagar is the one that reminds them that they are not utterly abandoned, but that they can have hope. Sometimes you will need one mother, and other days you will need the other mother. Go to Genesis chapter 24, verse 62. This is the story about Rebekah being brought to Isaac. And it says, now Isaac had come from Beer-lahai-roi, for he was living in the Negev. He went out to the field one evening to meditate, and as he looked up, he saw camels approaching, and Rebekah also looked up and saw Isaac. And this is the meeting of Rebekah and Isaac. Rebekah is coming, and Isaac is coming from Beer-lahai-roi. That's where Hagar is. Isaac was a mama's boy. He was, it's all right. And after his mother died, he went to his other mother. Sometimes Sarah is our mother, and sometimes Hagar is our mother. This story reminds us that sometimes we have to try on or embody different characters. We have to stop consistently identifying with the same person. We have to remember by entering into different embodiments and different characters that the story isn't always about you, but it is always about God. And in this story, Hagar reminds us or brings a word of hope to a people who may have forgotten that they too will be in moments where they need to hold on to the hope that God has placed in them and hope to give birth to freedom in the next generation. So as I end, My blessing for you all is that we may see like our mother Hagar, who named God, that we might see oppression and refuse to close our eyes, that we might see the promise ahead, and that we will always hold space for those who come behind us to inhabit and inherit. Thank you.
We do have some time for questions, and so I'm going to invite you. You're already mic'd up, see, so if I can stand here.
I'll stand here.
And remember, for those online, please do wait for a mic before you ask a question. So we've got a few minutes. Yes, please. Thank you.
Hi there. I am stuck on wild ass of a man actually being this free animal, and I think I have an idea of why that might be the translation that's used, but would love to hear you expound on that further.
Yeah, no, that has been a thing. That whole passage has really bothered me for forever. But growing up in a tradition that said this is about Isaac and not Ishmael, this was one of the ways we could interpret the text to other Ishmael and all those who came after him. But how does it change the narrative if it's not negative, but is free in a way that can't be contained? Now that's threatening, but it's a different kind of threat. And I think that these kinds of readings just push us away from this narrow, there is only one promise. There was never only one promise. Right?
Thank you. Yes, please, at the front here.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about okay, thank you. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the relationship between method and hermeneutics. The relationship between whatever your methodology is, if that's literary, and ultimately your interpretation, which is still different from one's theology, but I'm wrestling with it myself. But womanism is a perspective, but then we use a particular methodology, but womanism is not necessarily a methodology. I'm just going to keep talking until I figure out what I want to ask, but you get where I'm going, because as we look at your methodology, it's clearly very literary. So how do we move from literary to a hermeneutic or a theology or any other things?
No, I am struggling with that right now. And as many of you know, I'm writing a commentary on this part of the Bible, so I have to come up with a really good answer for what I'm doing. But what I believe I can say is that I am using a literary approach to the Bible. I believe that the text comes to us in a form that invites us. It is entertaining, and I think we find much from the text when we focus on how it says, as with the same energy that we focus on what it says. All of that work I do, however, comes out of this embodiment. And so this is why I think it's important to say up front, I'm obsessed with Hagar. I want to know what happens to her. I identify with her, and I don't even know if I have anything in common with her other than this location. And so for me, womanist has to do with where I stand, my context, the way I see the world, and that the literary approach is the methodology or the tools I use when I approach scripture. I'm not interested in reconstructing what happened historically. I'm not necessarily interested in a sociological reading of the text, even though that will come into play. But I will take my lead from the way the text tells the story.
Second row, and then at the back.
Hi, Bob Braxton.
Thank you. I was fascinated by the meaning of the word Hagar, and that's not exact. It's not even a name, actually. And what occurred to me was Deuteronomy 26:5, which is 3 words traditionally in the Seder, which we usually say, my father was a wandering Aramean,
Yes.
but I wonder
Yes.
if it means my ancestor, the wandering.
Yes. I mean, absolutely. So I'm not saying that Hagar is not a name. That could be her name. That means the stranger. But it is not lost on us that it very likely is not. But that gar or ger, as we would see in Hebrew, is the word that gets used to refer to what Abraham was. I mean, so the identity of these people is rooted in being sojourners. This is why all those rules about hospitality matter so much. So this woman, in the center, she is central to Israel's identity. And the trick for us, and for all of us in these stories, is what parts of our stories do we remember, right?
At the back, please.
So admittedly, my question may reflect my social location, but the act of naming God and not being consumed, creating God's identity belongs to the most marginalized, not to Abraham or to Sarah. So any thoughts on that construct?
Yay. So one of the things I think about a lot is there's so many ways in which the Bible is problematic, but this is not one of them, right? And so it's important that we tell the stories, remember the moments where God shows up in special ways for the marginalized. But we must do due diligence in telling those stories, right? But yes, I think it is this powerful moment. She is seen, she is heard. And she comes away with this word about who God is.
Now, if you're online, you can just add a question to the comments, and we have somebody tracking the conversation there. So do catch my eye if you have a question. Meanwhile, in the room, we have one just here, Casey, and at the front here.
Hello, Dr.
Hi,
Judy.
Will. How are you?
I'm part of the class of 2004, and I have been so grateful for your class called Moses Goes to the Movies.
Yes.
And as I heard you speak, I thought, well, what if Hagar went to the movies? And I thought perhaps you have some thoughts on popular culture and sort of speaking into that space about her role and significance.
Yeah.
Thanks.
That's a great question. So I had not thought about Hagar Goes to the Movies. What I have thought about through the lens of popular culture is Hagar as an anti-hero. That we talk about the anti-hero as someone who does the right things for the wrong reason, or the person who shows up in the wrong body. So for me, Hagar shows up in the wrong body and in this cultural context, and that makes her an anti-hero. Now, the beauty of that kind of thinking is as soon as you start dissecting it, everybody becomes an anti-hero. And that's beautiful if you think about it. I mean, it would mean a lot to me if we could get away from these interpretations of biblical characters like they were saints and just let them be who they were. Yes, he did. Yes, she did. That they did these things and God used them. That's the story, right? That's the testimony. So I love this idea of anti-hero. And so for a while I was saying, everyone in the Bible is an anti-hero except Jesus. And then I thought, wait, we can make Jesus an anti-hero too. And in ways that would be really powerful to think about how he shows up in a way that's not what people expected or wanted, and challenges us to rethink. I'll say one more thing about that. When we do this, when we center somebody like Hagar, it is liberating then not just for Hagar, but for all the other folks. Right? Okay.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much for this. I just wanted to say that you answered a question that's always been in my mind, or even gave me a possible answer to it, and I wanted to get your response. I've always been baffled by the way that story ends with Abram's death. And at the end, it says that Ishmael and Isaac come together to bury their father.
Yes.
And I've always looked and missed, well, how did they get together? It's not in the text anywhere. And this imagery of Isaac going to his other mother reunites this family in a way that's very helpful to me. So thank you.
Thank you. What do we know about the relationship between Ishmael and Isaac from their perspective? Right? In a plural household, they probably had meals together, they played together. That's what Sarah got upset about in chapter 21, or whatever was happening that made her realize that perhaps Ishmael would be a threat should Abraham die. I think there's a lot there.
Yes, please.
I too want to thank you for your
lecture.
I'm muddling in my head the conversation where she is elevated to second wife. People translate that concubine, but it's clearly second wife. And then she's demoted. And I can't think of any place else in the text where one can lose their status. Can you talk about, now this is the cultural story here, the impact of losing status, but also having the only heir at the moment?
That's what makes it tricky, right? So this does not reflect well on Abraham, right? So we know we have ancient Near Eastern law, extra biblical laws that would say a slave who becomes a concubine or second wife can be demoted if they somehow violate the agreement. But the fact that she's carrying his child is what makes this problematic. Yeah. And I have to think about that. I don't know to what extent that might play into her return as well. Because if you think about it, Ishmael was around for years before Isaac shows up. Right? Okay. Yeah, that's all I got.
Still muddled.
Yeah.
But I heard it.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Judy. I'm curious about the line in verse 2, and Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. And for me, I get echoes of Adam and Eve. You know, it wasn't me, it was her. She did it. But I wonder, like, should I be hearing that as an elevation of her voice? Like, she mattered so much that he listened to her, or is the text pinning the blame on her?
So what I love about the Bible is everything that's in the gap. And Abram listened to the voice. Why did he listen to the voice of Sarai? There are all kinds of possibilities. I mean, maybe he was being a dutiful husband and thought this will fix the situation. I suspect Hagar would have been the only person in the household as Sarai's handmaid that he would not have had access to physically anyway. Right? So this whole giving thing matters because as the head or lord of the house, technically he can have access to anyone, which is why we have all these rules in Leviticus telling people don't sleep with this person, don't sleep with this person, because people over the heads of the household were sleeping with their maids and with their wife's sister and with young boys. And so this is kind of the world in which that legislation comes. So I don't know what is happening there, but there are a lot of possibilities.
No, I was just thinking out loud.
We have, no, I don't think we do. Sorry, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Judy. So, coming from the African continent just last year, I can also attest to the fact that people are losing interest in what the Bible says. And also the issue of polygamy is still lingering. And whilst I was listening to you, it dawned on me to ask whether in developing our hermeneutics or interpreting the Bible, such incidents, we should pay attention to social construct instead of maybe miracle, because I know that the story of Sarah will come later, and preachers will talk about how miraculous it is for Sarah to conceive at old age, instead of maybe paying attention to these incidents that Hagar went through. So I just want to learn from you if I can push an idea that we should also pay attention to some of the things that we construct socially instead of the miracles that sometimes is almost impossible.
That was an amazing question, and yes, I think that we have to interpret the social construct, even as we take that, because the miracle happens within the social construct as well. So we need to always remember that. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Okay, now I do have a note on my program here to invite a member of the Womenist Conclave forward. Is that still part of the design? Yes. A nod this end.
No, it's not me.
Please. You can use the mic.
It is a delight to not only see, but to hear your brilliance and the wonderful soil and the good ground that this institution has been to you for 2 decades, and to Virginia Theological Seminary. It took 2 decades, but you did a very good thing. Good ground, a foundation, and the future. What you have given, as one of your mothers has said so wonderfully today, you have shown us the bump in the road. Hagar is a bump that gives us not only a theological way of reframing, a hermeneutical way of reframing, but a methodological way as well, that what we know to be true because of our embodied phenomenological perspectives actually speaks to the speculative fiction that has been called history.
Yes. Amen. Amen. That part right there, Stacey.
And the way in which her story is the future. We thank you for that, and we want to make sure that you all are here to truly celebrate and invest in this genius and generative mind by being with us tomorrow during a special presentation that we will have as a panel, where we will be talking about, for such a time as this, honoring the life, legacy, and work of womanist thought and theology as evidenced through this wonderful scholar, as we talk about the state of our union in these yet-to-be United States. We bless you on behalf of the Black Religious Scholars Group, the Womanist Conclave, the American Academy of Religion, the Society for Biblical Literature, that in this day, in this moment, it has been consecrated that they have not dodged, but have named you the Dodge Professor of Biblical Interpretation. Blessings.
Friends, what a feast. There's nothing more to be added to what you've just heard. So please gather at 5:15. And meanwhile, take this moment to thank God for the extraordinary gift of the Reverend Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams in our midst. Thank you, everybody, for coming.